We are on DAF Lamed Beis Omed Beis. We are 6 lines from the bottom at the Mishnah. Shofar shel Rosh HaShana ein ma'avirin alav es hatuchum ve'ein mefakhin alav es hagol. So the Mishnah is really, the point of the Mishnah is telling me that there may be circumstances where in order for me to blow shofar at a particular place or time, I would have to violate the laws of Yantif. And the Mishnah is telling me that you can't, even if it's a rabbinic law. So you're not allowed to take the shofar beyond the tchum of Yantif, beyond the 2,000 amas of the tchum, and you're not allowed to remove a pile of rubble in order to get to a shofar. That's the issue of muktzah. Lo olin be'ilan v'lo rochven al gabi behema v'lo shatan al penei hamoyim. You're not allowed to climb a tree or to ride on an animal or to float on some device on the water. All of these things are rabbinically prohibited. Ve'ein choschen oso ben bedavar shu mishum shavus ben bedavar shu mishum lo sa'aseh. Nor are you allowed to cut the shofar down to size in order to make it blowable, and that makes no difference whether the cutting would involve a rabbinic prohibition or a biblical prohibition. But if you want to put water or wine in the shofar, that'll help give it a better sound, so then you're allowed to do that. And that there's no malacha involved in that. It's almost like, it's just like there's no tikkun really over there. It's you're definitely improving it, but there's not even an Isser D'Rabbanan involved.
Typically they use vinegar.
Nowadays a lot of people use vinegar. You'll see there's another ingredient that was used in the times of the Gemara. Ein ma'akvin es hatinokos miliskoa, avol misaskin yimohin ad sheyilmedu. That you don't stop children if they would like to blow shofar in Rosh Hashanah. If they want to blow it for themselves, gesundheit hate, even though you could argue they're not obligated in the mitzvah, and therefore maybe they shouldn't be handling a shofar. But nevertheless, if they want to blow it for themselves, they can. And avol misaskin yimohin ad sheyilmedu. And furthermore, you can actually go ahead. Actually, the Graz Girso is umis askeni mohin. You can actually help train them. You can encourage them and actually help them blow the shofar until they learn how to do it themselves. V'hamis asek lo yatsa. And furthermore, if you're engaged in this kind of misasik activity, where you're not blowing it in order to, you're doing it just to demonstrate to a child, or you're doing it for some other reason. You could be just playing around yourself. In all of those cases where you're not doing it for the mitzvah, you're not yotzei. V'hashomea min hamisasek lo yatsa. And furthermore, if you hear it from someone who's a misasek, who's just playing around or practicing, or doing it for non-mitzvah purposes, you're not yotzei either. So the Gemara now says, my taima, what's the reason why Yantif cannot be violated for the sake of shofar? The answer is very simple. Shofar asehu v'yom tov aseh v'lo sa'aseh v'ein aseh doches lo sa'aseh ba'aseh. Because even though normally we say that a positive commandment overrides a standard negative commandment, but Yantif is both a positive and negative commandment. There's an obligation of Shabboson. The Torah calls Yantif a day of rest, and it also says Kol malacha lo sasu, do not do work. So a positive commandment cannot override Yantif. Okay, and therefore lo olin be'ilan v'lo rochen al gabi behema chulei. You're not allowed to climb a tree, and you're not allowed to ride an animal. And furthermore, it says you're not allowed to remove it from under rubble. Now, let's be clear. All of those are rabbinic prohibitions, but the way Rashi understands it, the Gemara divides it into 2 different types of rabbinic prohibitions. Hashta de Rabbanan amart lo deoraisa mibaya. He says there are 2 types of rabbinic prohibitions. One is where, like the rabbis had a general isser like muktzah. So therefore, you can't lift up rubble in order to get to the shofar. Is there a possibility that you're going to violate, to do an isser deoraisa by handling muktzah? No, that's not really, there's no direct fear. Whereas there are other rabbinic prohibitions where there's a direct concern, and the reason why the rabbis forbade it is because they wanted to avoid you doing an isser deoraisa. So for example, they said, don't climb a tree lest you break off a branch, which would be a malacha deoraisa. So the Gemara's question is that if a rabbinic prohibition where there's no fear of a deoraisa violation is forbidden, then surely a rabbinic prohibition where there's a fear of a deoraisa violation should surely be forbidden.
Isn't most
Why would the rabbis do anything if they weren't trying to keep the Torah?
Well, you're right, Bob. It's a good point. That's why I qualified it by saying that there's no direct fear. In other words, sometimes, like for example, muktzah, one of the reasons the rabbis forbade muktzah is to ultimately prevent you from carrying on Shabbos. At least that's one of the explanations as to why they did it. But there's no direct concern that by handling muktzah you're going to carry it outside. It's a general prohibition as a protection around the Torah to make sure that you don't handle things that will eventually cause you to carry. So the Gemara says, Zu ve'ein sarach lomar zu ketani. So the Gemara says, you're right. You're right. He says, it really wasn't necessary to write all of these examples. Write the most innocuous rabbinic prohibition, and then surely you would know the more cautious rabbinic prohibition, or the more concerned rabbinic prohibition. But sometimes for stylistic reasons, the Mishnah writes the halacha for A, and it goes without saying that the halacha is true by B as well. Next, ve'ein choschen oso bein bedavar shu mishum shavus bein bedavar shu mishum lo saseh. You're not allowed to cut a shofar, regardless of whether that involves a rabbinic prohibition or a biblical prohibition. Mishum shavus magla lo saseh sakina. So the example, if you were to cut a shofar with a scythe, which is not the normal method of cutting a shofar, that would be only a rabbinic prohibition. If you were to cut it with a knife, which is its normative method, so then there would be an isser d'oraisa of tikkun mana, of fixing a kli. So the Gemara's question is the same. Hashta mishum shavus amart lo sasa mibaya. If you've already told me that cutting it where there's only a rabbinic prohibition is usher, then surely if there's a biblical prohibition, that would be usher too. So the Gemara acknowledges that. Zu mein sarach lomer zu ketani. You're right. For stylistic reasons, it wrote A, and it goes without saying that B is also true. Next, if you want, you could put water or wine in the shofar. Mayim o yayin in may raglayim lo. That seems only that water and wine, but urine, you're not allowed to. Now, urine has the same qualities as vinegar. It's acidic, and therefore it would tenderize the shofar so that it has certain advantages. But it seems like you're not allowed to use that. Masnis and mani abasholhi. Therefore, our Mishnah goes like abashol. The Tanya abashol omer maimo yayin mutter k'dei l'tzachzecho. That you're allowed to add water or wine in order to clarify it, I suppose would be a good way of translating it. But meira glaim asr mipnei hakavod. But you can't add urine to it because that would be disrespectful. You have to treat the shofar as a tashmish shel mitzvah, and therefore you have to treat it respectfully, which is sort of a relief because I wouldn't want to blow something that was soaking in urine. But
do you have to bury a shofar?
What?
You have to bury your shofar, let's say it's broken or...
Well, that's a whole sugya in Maseches Brachos about tashmishe mitzvah nizrakim. All things that are used for a mitzvah that you're no longer using can simply be discarded. But there's a proper minhag to discard it respectfully. You're not obligated to bury it, but you should not throw it into trash heap exposed. Same thing like tzitzis or anything else. The Gemara now says, or lulav, ein ma'akvenes hatinokos miliskoa, you don't stop the children from blowing. So it sounds like that if there are other people that are exempt from the mitzvah, then you do stop them. For example, hanashim ma'akvin. If a woman wishes to blow, we would tell her not to blow. So the Gemara's question is, "V'hatanya ein ma'akvin loas hanashim loas hatinokos." There's a brisa that contradicts that. This brisa says we don't prevent either women or children from blowing, even though they're both exempt. Why then does our Mishnah only permit children to blow and not women? So Amar Rabbi lo kasha, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shimon. It's a machlokas tanoim. The Tanya daber b'nei Yisrael. B'nei Yisrael samchin ve'benos Yisrael samchos divrei Rabbi Yehuda. The Torah talks about, in talking about the karbanos, it says, speak to the sons of Israel. From here we learn that only sons of Israel do what's called smicha, which is to press down on a sacrificial animal before it's brought as a sacrifice. But Jewish women do not. There's no mitzvah for a woman to do smicha, and therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, since they have no mitzvah to do it, they're not permitted to do it. It's not that they have an option, right? They're not permitted to. But Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, Omrim Noshin Samchos Rishus, and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon disagree, and they say no. If they want to, they can. We give women the opportunity to do a mitzvah saseh that they're not obligated to do, such as smicha, such as blowing the shofar, such as sitting in the sukkah. Now, obviously, you and I know that we paskin like Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon in this regard. We allow women to sit in the sukkah. We don't tell them we don't kick them out of the sukkah. Rabbi Yehuda would say if they're patur from the mitzvah, then they're not supposed to be makayim the mitzvah, and we don't paskin that way. And the same thing is true with shofar. We would go like Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yossi and say if they want to blow shofar, they have every right to do so. They can be yotzi the mitzvah on their own. They're not obligated to hear it from a man. And so Tosfos here talks about the whole, and there's a lot of discussion in the Rishonim over here about the whole issue of a woman making a bracha on a mitzvah saseh shazman grama, on a time-bound commandment that a woman is exempt from. Can she say asher kiddishanu b'mitzvos of vitzivanu, that God commanded us? And the conclusion of the poskim is that yes, of course they can, because since they are makayim a mitzvah, they're considered to be part of the mitzvah, even though they're exempt. They don't have, if they want to get out of it, they can. But still, it's the mitzvah kiyumas. They're still makayim a mitzvah by doing it.
If you're not,
they fulfill.
According to Rabbi Yehuda, he says that wouldn't make sense that he says no because it's yontif and it's like musical instruments. If they're not chayiv and shofar.
No. I think that
it's not the issue at all.
No, I don't think that's the issue. I think that it has to do with the fact that if you're not obligated in a mitzvah, it could be that maybe sukkah would be different. It could be, you're right. It could be that if there's only a compelling argument like blowing shofar or doing smicha. But smicha is not just on yantif. Smicha, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't permit women to do smicha, period. He doesn't want you to get involved with that mitzvah at all, since you're patur.
Is he worried about Baal Tosef?
Yeah, that's what it says in our script.
Oh, yeah?
It seems it could be that it's a type of Baal Tosef. Since you're patur from the mitzvah, we don't want you to give the wrong impression.
Rabbi, the example that they gave now with women doesn't fit really with what the Mishnah was saying. The Mishnah was talking about kids who were, let's say, just fooling around or practicing whatever, not trying to be yotze, and yet the argument now...
No. The Mishnah was telling us two things. The Mishnah was telling us that we don't prevent tinokos from blowing in order to be makayim their mitzvah, and we're also allowed to work with them to help train them how to blow.
This is the whole, we're going to get into the whole tefillin argument as well.
Right, so I spoke about tefillin. Tefillin is a special case because the Gemara says that tefillin requires a guf naki, a clean body. So as a general rule, anyone who's exempt from the mitzvah is not permitted to put on tefillin because there's a liability involved that if you don't have a clean body or if you flatulate while you're wearing your tefillin, you commit an aveira. So that's why we tell people who are exempt not to put on tefillin, including women. And that's what the Ramah paskins. But all other mitzvahs, aseh shazman grama, all other time-bound mitzvahs, a woman has every right to fulfill.
Tzitzis doesn't have that problem, I guess.
Tzitzis does not have that problem. A woman's allowed to wear tzitzis if she wants to. There's a Mishnah Berurah says, but she should do it quietly because of yuhara, because it looks like she's flaunting something that she's not obligated to do. Okay. Avol misaskin bahem ad sheyilmadu, you're allowed to work with the child until they learn. Amar Rabbi Elazar afilu b'Shabbos. This is true even on Shabbos. You're allowed to work with a child to train him how to blow the shofar, which is a bit surprising. Even though the rabbi said that there's no mitzvah of tekiah shofar on Shabbos, you're still allowed to help a child learn how to blow, obviously provided that you don't carry the shofar outside. Tanya nami hachi misaskin bahen ad sheyilmadu afilu b'Shabbos. That you can help train a child to blow, even on Shabbos. And we don't prevent a child from blowing on Shabbos, and it goes without saying that we don't prevent him from blowing on Yom Tov, where there's actually a mitzvah. So the Gemara says, Hagufa kasha, this is in itself contradictory, because Amart misaskin bahenat sheyilmadu vafilu b'Shabbos amalachatchila amrinim tiku. So this is a contradiction within the Mishnah. The first, the statement of the Mishnah was, the second statement was, then that you're allowed to work with the child, even lechatchila, to help the child learn how to blow the shofar. But earlier we had said that you don't prevent a child from blowing, which implies that if he blows it, you don't have to stop him. But it's only b'di'evet. If he started blowing, you don't have to stop him. It's mashma that you don't lechatchila engage him. So the Gemara says, so lo kasha kan bekatan shehigia lechinuch, kan bekatan shelo higia lechinuch. So the Gemara says it's very easily reconciled. When you're dealing with a child who's of educational age to learn how to blow the shofar, then even lechatchila there's a mitzvah to train him. When you're dealing with a child who's so young that he doesn't have even a chinuch mitzvah, because he's not yet capable of understanding the whole concept of shofar, like he's like a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, whatever it is, so then we don't tell you to lechatchila go ahead and try to train him. He's too young. But if he's already blowing, then there's no need to stop him. Next, v'hamis asek lo yatsa, that if a person is just blowing it to help teach a child, or for any other reason he's fiddling around or playing around, he's not yotze the mitzvah of shofar. So misasek hu delo yatsa hatokei l'shir yatsa. But it sounds like from our Mishnah that if you're blowing it with intent, just not for the intent of the mitzvah, but rather for the intent of producing sound, then you would be yotze. Misasek to the Gemara's ears implies a person who doesn't even have the intent of producing actual sound, just to be able to fiddle around or play around or to show a child how to put it to your lips. But your kavana is not to produce a tekiah. It just so happens that if you do produce a tekiah, you're not yotze. It's mashma that if your intention is to produce a musical note, but you don't have the kavana for the mitzvah, you will be yotze. So lema misayei le Rava d'amar Rava hatokei l'shir yatsa. This supports Rava, who says that you don't have mitzvah saying tzrichas kavana. You don't have to have kavana specifically for the mitzvah, as long as your kavana is to produce a sound. That's enough to be yotze. So the Gemara says, no, you can't really infer that from our Mishnah, because dilma tokei l'shir nami misasek karilei. Because maybe when our Mishnah uses the term misasek, it's a more generic term of misasek, which means anytime you don't have the intention of fulfilling the mitzvah. It could be that even when you blow with the intent of producing sound, that's also called misasek, even though you know what you're doing, but since you didn't have the intention for the mitzvah, that could be the more generic term misasek. And so therefore you can't infer it one way or the other. And furthermore, if you hear it from a misasek, from a person who's fiddling around with the shofar, and he produces a good sound, you're also not going to be yotze. But that implies that the only time you're not going to be yotze when you hear it from someone else is if that person did not have the intention of blowing it for tekiah shofar. It's mashma that if the person had the kavanah for tekiah shofar, even though he didn't have you in mind to be motzi you could still be yotze by hearing his tekiah. Lema tihavi tiyufte de Rabbi Zera, de Amar le Rabbi Zera l'shamei ichvenu sekali. This seems to be a refutation of Rabbi Zera, because Rabbi Zera was very careful that when his servant or his attendant would blow for him, he told him, be careful to have me in mind, to be motzi me when you blow, because if you're not going to have me in mind, I'm not going to be yotze. So you see that the mashmiya, the person blowing, has to have you in mind, which contradicts what our Mishnah is saying, which implies that even if they don't have you in mind, you're going to be yotze. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you what, Dilma Aidi the Tana Reisha Misasek, Tana Seifa Nami Misasek. Not necessarily so. Maybe all that you can infer is that for stylistic reasons, this last part was talking about misasek as well, because the previous section of the Mishnah was also talking about a misasek. But perhaps in reality, anytime the mashmiya, the blower, does not have the listener in mind, then the listener will not be yotze. Even if he's not a misasek, even if he's blowing it for the sake of the mitzvah, the listener will also not be yotze. So you have no raya from our Mishnah.
We paskin in the end, if the person hears it and didn't have in mind, is he yotze or not?
Lechatchila mitzvah strichas kavana. B'di'evet, it's a big discussion in the poskim. I think it's mitzvah dependent, if I'm not mistaken, if my memory serves me well. It depends on the mitzvah. Different cases. The Mishnah now says, Seder Tekiyo Shalosh Shel Shalosh Shalosh. So the Mishnah now tells us, what is the order of Tekiya shofar? We know that in the Amidah, you're supposed to blow the shofar, and there are 3 blessings in the Amidah that warrant tekiya shofar, malchios, zichronos, and shofros. And you blow the shofar at the end of each one. So the Mishnah tells me that each bracha gets a set of 3. So 3 sets of 3 is essentially what the Mishnah is saying. What are the 3 sounds? Tekiya, Trua, Tekiya. Those are 3 distinct sounds, and you blow 3 of those 3 times. So it's 3 times 3. Shir Tekiya Kishalosh Truos. The next part of the Mishnah is that the length of a Tekiya is 3 Truas, and Shir Trua Kishalosh Yavavos. And the length of a Trua is 3 Yavavos. What is a Yavava? We'll learn that shortly. It's some kind of crying sound. Now, Taka Barishona Umashach Bishnia Kishtayim Ein Biyado Ela Echas. We saw this many times already, that if a person wants to try and do an extra long tekiya to have it act as 2 tekiyas, so for example, he's blowing the last tekiya of Malchios and he wants it to count as the first tekiya for Zichronos, so he just makes a double long tekiya. He says that doesn't work, because you have to divide, every tekiya has to have a beginning and an end. You can't append one tekiya to another. Okay, Misha Beirach ve'achar kach nizdamein lo shofar tokeya umeria v'tokeya shalosh pa'amim. Now, if a person already davened his amida, and then he gets a shofar, so he just has to produce 9 sounds. Tekiya, trua, tekiya 3 times. That would produce 9 sounds, and that's how he'll be outside. The point of the Mishnah is that even though lechatchila, the shofar should be blown al haseder, according to the order of the blessings in the Amida, if you didn't get a shofar and you already daven musaf and then a shofar arrives, you can still blow the shofar afterwards. Kishem sheshliach tzibur chayev kakol yachid v'yachid chayev. And then the Mishnah says that just like the Shliach Tzibur has an obligation, who's leading the Amida, he has an obligation to blow shofar, so too every individual has an obligation to blow shofar. And on that, Rabbi Gamliel Omer, Shliach Tzibur motzi asarabim yedei chovasan. That the Shliach Tzibur is motzi everyone in their obligation. Now, whether it's talking about shofar, whether it's talking about the Amida, the Gemara will have to clarify that. Let's take a look at the Gemara. ve-chatima shir tekiya kitrua. How could the Mishnah say that 1 tekiya equals 3 truas? We have another brisa that says that 1 tekiya equals 1 trua. So Amar Rabbi Tana didan kachashiv tekiya dekulu bave, utruas dekulu bave. Tana bera kachashiv chad bava vesula. Answers the Gemara, answers Abaya, there is no disagreement between the brisa and the Mishnah. They're really saying the same thing. Our Mishnah is telling us that the measurement of the 3 tekiyas, each tekiya added together, is going to be 3 truas. And the measurement, and the Bryce is saying that each tekiya equals 1 teruah. So there's no disagreement, even though it's a little bit difficult to read that in the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says that 1 tekiya equals 3 truas. But the way you read it is that the measurement of all of the tekiyas, all 3 tekiyas equals 3 truas. So 1 tekiya ultimately equals 1 teruah. So shir teruah kigimel yavavos, and how much is a teruah? 3 yavavas. So now the Gemara says v'hatana shir teruah kishlosha shavarim. But there's another brisa that says that 1 teruah equals 3 shavarim, not 3 yavavas. So which one is it? Amar Abaya v'havadai pligi. Abaya says there's no way to reconcile these 2 brises, or the brise and the Mishnah. There definitely is a machlokas over here between the brise and the Mishnah. Dichsiv yom teruah yiyelochem u'metargaminan yom yavava yehi. That the Torah, when it talks about Rosh HaShana as a yom teruah, as a day of the blast, the Targum calls the word teruah a yavava. Now, what is a yavava? Uchsiv be'imei de Sisra barachalon nishkafa v'tiyabev em Sisra. It says that when Sisra was killed by Yael, Devorah sang a song about this victory. Yael, the king of the Assyrians, Yael sang a song of victory, and or the general, right? And it says that Sisra's mother stood by the window, realizing that her son was not coming back, Batiyabev, and she gave forth a wailing, or a cry, or a whimper. Mar Savar Genuche Ganachu Mar Savar Yilule Yilil. So what's the machlokus of the brises? The machlokus is, what is a cry? One Mando Amar says it's Genuche Ganach, which is like a moaning or a sobbing, and the other one holds that it's Yilula Yilil, it's like a whimper. What's the difference between the two? A sab is right? That's the shvarim. And what's a whimper? Right? That's the trua, right? And so there are different kinds of cries. And by the way, we end up with a three-way machlokes as to what a trua actually is. One possibility is that it's just the shvarim, it's just the genuche, it's just the moaning ha ha ha. The other opinion is that it's just a whimper, right? And the third opinion is that it's both a sobbing and a whimper, and then And the reason why it's not a fourth possibility is because people don't first whimper and then sob. You first sob and then whimper. So that's why it would be shvarm trua, not a possibility of trua shvarm. Okay? Tanu Rabbana. Minayin shebishofar. So the Brisa continues and it says, how do you know that the instrument that you use is a shofar on Rosh HaShana? Tamolomer ve'havarta shofar trua. Because the Torah says in the context of the Yom Kippur of Yovel, you shall cause the shofar to blow out, to make it sound. Ainli ela biyovel b'Rosh HaShana minayin. That's only on Yovel. How do you know that it applies to Rosh HaShana too, where the word shofar is not used? Tamolomer b'chodesh hashvi'i. So the Torah, in the context of Yom Kippur of the Yovel, says it shall be in the 7th month. Now we already know that it's Yom Kippur. She says she'ein tamalomer b'chodesh hashvi. So there's no reason to tell me that it's in the 7th month because I already know that Yom Kippur is the 7th month of the year, is in Tishrei. So umat tamalomer b'chodesh hashvi sheyu kol teruah shel chodesh shvi zekazeh. It's to teach me that all the blowings of the 7th month shall be equal. So if the shofar is used on Yovel, Yom Kippur Yovel, so it has to be used on Rosh Hashanah every year as well. How do you know that a trua, which is what the sound that the Torah talks about on Rosh Hashanah, has to be preceded by a tekiah, a straight out sound? Tamulomar ve'ha'avarta shofar trua. Because the Torah says by the Yovel you shall cause to go out. Ve'ha'avarta. Rashi says ve'ha'avarta is a language of a straight, consistent sound, elongated sound. That's what the word ha'avara, to cause to go out straight. So therefore that teaches me that before the word teruah is v'ha'avarta, so you have to have a tekiah before a teruah. Because right after the words teruah, right after the word teruah is used in the pasuk of Yovel, it says ta'aviru shofar. On Yom Kippur you shall cause the ha'avara of the shofar. So therefore it tells me that there's a tekiah before, a ha'avara of a tekiah before, and a ha'avara of tekiah afterwards. Ve'enli ela biyovel b'Rosh HaShana minayin. And that only tells me that there's supposed to be tekiah, trua tekiah, on the Yom Kippur of Yovel. How do you know that this applies on Rosh Hashanah as well? Tamulomar b'chodesh hashvi'i. Therefore the Torah says in the 7th month. She'ein tamalomer b'chodesh hashvi, ma tamalomer b'chodesh hashvi, she'kol trus chodesh hashvi zekazeh. Because there's no reason to write that Yom Kippur is the 7th month. I already know that. The answer is it writes it as a hekesh to tell you that all of the blasts of the 7th month are exactly equivalent.
So why wouldn't we do it on Yom Kippur?
Uminayin,
every year.
No, it's only on Yovel. The Torah in Parshas Bahar is talking about tekiah shofar in Yovel. When you blow the shofar during the 7th month, it has to be the same. It has to be the same. It has to be with the shofar. It has to be tekiah, trua tekiah. Uminayin l'shalosh shel shalosh shalosh. And how do you know that you have to have 3 sets of 3? Tamulomar v'ha'avarta shofar trua shabbason zichron trua yom trua yelachem. So the answer is that we have the word trua written 3 times in the Torah. Once in the context of the Yovel, and 2 in the context of Rosh Hashanah. 1 in Parshas Bahar, which is talking about the Yom Kippur of Yovel, v'havarta shofar trua. Once in Parshas Emor, Shabbos and Zichron Trua for Rosh Hashanah, and once in Parshas Pinchas, Yom Trua Yelachem. So since I have the word Trua written 3 times, I know that you have to have 3 sets of Truas. And how do you know that you don't divide them and say, well, whatever's written by Yom Kippur Yovel applies there, and whatever's written by Rosh Hashanah applies there, but you don't mix and match them. Tamulomar Shavi'i Shavi L'Gzeira Shava. So the answer is that the word Shavi is written by the Yovel, the word Shavi is written by Rosh Hashanah. So it tells you to connect them all together and say that you have a grouping of 3 that goes to each. So Ha'keit Tzad Shalosh She'ein Teisha. Therefore, the Brisa says that it's 3 sets of 3 for a total of 9 sounds for both Rosh Hashanah and for the Yom Kippur of Yovel. And finally, the Brisa says, Shir Tekiya Kitrua, Shir Trua Kishlosha Shvarim, that the length of a Tekiya is the length of a Trua, and the length of a Trua is 3 Shvarim. Ha, ha, ha. Now, let's analyze this Brisa for just 1 second. Haitana me'ikara ma'isila behekesha, v'hashta ma'isila b'gzeira shava, question mark? I don't understand. Previously, you had used the hekesh to tell me that whatever applies on Yovel applies on Rosh Hashanah. Why now are you bringing a Gezeira Shava? Well, let me just clarify. A Gezeira Shava can only be made if you have a tradition going back to Moshe Rabbeinu for a Gezeira Shava. You can't just find 2 words that 2 psukim have in common and say, smack, there's now a halachic connection. No, there has to be a Mesorah to make a Gezeira Shava. A hekesh is a logical connection that's based on verbiage in the Torah that seems to connect 2 ideas. But it's not based on 2 words being identical. So that you don't need a Mesorah for. So the question is, if you have a Gezeira Shava, why did you need to use the Hekesh previously? So Hachikomer, Ilav Gezeira Shava, Hava Maisina La Behekesha. Hashta da Asya Gezeira Shava, Hekesha Lo Tzarech. The answer is, says the Gemara, the way you understand the Bryce is like this. If I didn't have a Gezeira Shava as a tradition, then I could have derived that the laws of Yovel apply to Rosh Hashanah and vice versa, using the Hekesh of Chodesh HaShavi'i. But now that I have a Gezeira Shava that goes back to Moshe Rabbeinu to tell me that I connect Rosh Hashanah to Yovel, I don't need the Hekesh anymore. We'll hold it here for today. Have a wonderful day.